Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me on here. I'm really excited about this and really delighted to be on this podcast. I'm a big fan. Um, so, yes, I am a chartered physiotherapist. So, I did a 4-year honours degree in physiotherapy. That's what brought me from Ireland to Scotland in the first place. I came over in 1996 and I finished my training in 2000 in Aberdeen in the north of Scotland, and then I moved to Edinburgh and got a job in a hospital here in the NHS. And I worked as a normal human physiotherapist for a few years, and then my plan was always to retrain and become an equine physiotherapist. So I did a master's course in veterinary physiotherapy at the Royal Veterinary College in London, which was part-time. I was able to work in Edinburgh in the NHS at the same time, and I flew down once a month. We did weekend lectures, and then we did lots of self-study and placement days with all other physios who are already working with animals. Um, so I am an ACPAT physiotherapist, which is the Association of Chartered Physiotherapists in Animal Therapy, which is a splinter group of the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy. So to be eligible with them, you have to be a human physiotherapist first and then become a veterinary physiotherapist.
I think that's the same. I don't know if you know anything about the process here in the States, but I think it's similar well, I don't want to speak. I don't know. We'll edit this part out, but I do think it's similar for physiotherapists here, some of them. So, oh my God, my voice. I'm so sorry. This is like the weirdest start to a podcast we've ever had. I know that my sister, for instance, she's a DVM, and she had to go to some human chiropractor training before she didn't have to go through the whole thing, but before she went to do the animal and equine focused chiropractic work. And they split it up from dogs and all of that sort of thing. But anyway, so we are here today to talk about something that plagues us all, no matter who you are, no matter if you are an Olympian listening to this, which that would be amazing if you're an Olympian listening to this podcast, or if you are just a trail rider and want to make your horse as comfortable as possible, and you want to get off of your horse, not feeling like you are walking sideways or you're doing like the cowboy walk. So Maeve, let's start here. What does rider symmetry mean in the saddle? Like, what needs to be equal? What needs to be symmetrical?
Well, it's tricky, isn't it? Because as humans, we're not naturally symmetrical. And really, horses are not naturally symmetrical either. But we know that asymmetry in the rider causes asymmetry in the horse. They have done studies on that. And so we know that we need to sit on a horse as symmetrically as possible, because if we don't, we can affect how they move, and that can lead to problems further down the line for them and for us. And so I guess rider symmetry means to be even through your aids and even left to right through your seat aids, your leg aids, and your hand aids. And for me, the most important part of the rider is their seat, because that's the one that's in direct contact with the horse. And so it's being able to weight your seat evenly, so not having more weight front to back, more weight side to side, one side than the other, or to be twisted in the saddle. So you want that to be as symmetrical as possible. And there are, I'd say, less sports that, there are a lot of sports that people do that it's good to be asymmetrical. For example, well, with you guys, baseball, tennis, golf, all of those sports people will be asymmetrical, and that's to their advantage in some ways to be so. But for us in our sport, we're affecting another living being, therefore we really need to be as symmetrical as possible.
You mentioned something that I want to come back to. Humans are not naturally symmetrical. This is something that is news to me. And actually, when you have, as you can recall, Maeve, like when you have a baby, they come out and sometimes they have something called like torticollis, which means that their head is tilted to the side. So literally from the moment that you're born, you are not symmetrical, which I've never thought about before. Like we have 2 arms, 2 legs, most of us, 2 feet, 2 hands. We look relatively symmetrical from the outside, but it doesn't work that way.
No, it doesn't work that way. If you even think about your internal organs and how they're weighted, you know, you're not symmetrical. So your right lung's slightly bigger than your left lung. Your heart sits on your left side of your body. Your liver, which is one of your heaviest organs, sits on the right side of your body. So, you know, internally, you're not symmetrical.
Is everyone's right lung bigger than their left lung?
Yeah, slightly. Yeah, yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to do this podcast.
And because of where your heart sits, and generally everybody's liver is on the right side, and that's one of the heaviest organs. So you know, internally, and even your guts, I think, are more on your right side. Don't quote me on that though. But even your internal organs aren't set up symmetrically. Then, if you take it further out into your skeleton, most people, vast majority of people, will have one foot slightly bigger than the other, one hand slightly bigger than the other. Leg length differences are hugely common. I think 70% of the population have a leg length discrepancy that doesn't doesn't necessarily cause any issues. So, and then when you start to go into that in more detail, sometimes people's pelvises are slightly different left to right. People's hips slightly different left to right. So yeah, no, we're not naturally symmetrical, and normally that's totally fine because we adapt and we do what we need to do, and our bodies are really clever at adapting. But when we sit in a horse, we really need to be as symmetrical as possible, and that's where it becomes a bit trickier.
Right, because they have to first of all carry our weight, and you think about like the different gaits. Some of those gaits move in diagonal pairs. Some of those their gaits move symmetrically, like the trot. But then, you know, you have like the canter where you have one lead or another. And so I've experienced this in my own riding. If there's a little bit of asymmetry, it kind of gets amplified in those gaits that have, you know, that are not symmetrical gaits. I think it's really interesting, though, that we'll say a 150-pound rider can influence a 1,500-pound horse's body that much. Why is that?
Well, yeah, it is. Definitely, we can. And it's fascinating, isn't it, that we can have such a big impact on them. But they have done studies. So there was a study done by Russell Guire. He runs Centre Biomechanics. I don't know if you've heard of that. Mm-hmm. But he kind of made riders asymmetrical and then measured that effect on the horse. So he shortened their one stirrup, I think it was by 5 centimeters. And it was really interesting because then the horses compensated quite quickly how they moved through their backs and also how they loaded their limbs, and they tended to load the limbs more on the side that wasn't shortened. So they increased the limb loading on the opposite side to the shortened stirrup. So if you think of a rider that collapses a hip or loads one seat bone more than the other, then their horse is constantly limb loading on one side more than the other. And most injuries in horses are not caused by, you know, specific traumas. A lot of them are repetitive strain type injuries where the one limb has been loaded for a long time. So that definitely we can have a huge impact on our horses. And then there was another study that looked at saddle pressure with riders in different positions. So riders that tipped forward, there was obviously more increased pressure at the front of the saddle. Riders that collapsed a hip, there was more pressure on the opposite side to the collapsed hip. And then riders who leaned their torso one way, there was more pressure on the side that they leaned to, which all makes sense. But the interesting bit is that the horses adapt to that. They change how they move, but with doing that, they are, compensating for the rider, and then limb loading more on one. And then if we think of injuries further down the line, possibly is that. If you look at like event riders or jump riders, how a horse chooses to land after a fence, if the rider is loading one seat bone or one stirrup more than the other, then that's going to alter what leg the horse lands on. And if they're coming down over huge fences, think of the impact through that front leg.
That leads me to my next question. Is there a discipline of riders that you think needs to be most focused on this? And what riders do you most commonly work with?
I think all riders need to be focused on this, if I'm being honest. So even just what we would call happy hackers here, so trail riders.
Happy hackers. I love that.
So still, your horse is still going to compensate for you. So if you want to really optimize the welfare of your horse and the comfort of your horse, then I really think all riders need to work on their symmetry on and off the saddle. Then I think if you look into disciplines, I tend to work mostly with event riders and dressage riders. I do a lot of happy hackers as well. But my kind of, I suppose, riders that compete a lot tend to be eventers. I work a lot with eventers and with dressage riders. And if you want to improve your performance, you need to look at these little marginal gains. So whether it is for a dressage rider, your changes are better one way than the other. Is that you? Is that the horse? Is it a bit of both? For the event riders, I did have an event rider that was getting a lot of similar injuries in the horses. We looked at the rider, did a lot of work with the rider, and touch wood, we've reduced the injury rate a bit.
Wow.
Now, we obviously changed how they trained the horses a bit as well, but I think by making the rider more symmetrical, you can definitely have an impact on the horse.
I mean, that makes sense though, because if you have an asymmetry that is affecting your horse and causing them to load their limbs more repeatedly on one limb or in one way, especially because I also have this suspicion, maybe we can talk about this later. I have this suspicion that if you have an asymmetry as a rider, you're probably, even an imperceptible amount, going to travel one direction, whichever direction is more comfortable for you, more than the other when you're just training at home. Do you see that at all?
Yeah, I think we're probably all guilty of that, aren't we? Because it feels better, maybe.
Yeah.
Or then I think there are probably others who would almost do the opposite. So I don't know. I don't know. It probably depends a bit on the person, but I think, for most of us who are leisure riders,
we all have like a direction that we're like, oh, I don't want to do this side, or at least I do. But if we think about what typically causes, especially chronic injuries, but even acute ones as well, it's a lot of repeated strain. It's a lot of that, either repeated concussion or repeated strain. It also, in the horses, like, we know that muscular fatigue greatly increases their risk of soft tissue injury. So again, if they're traveling and locomoting in a way that is a consequence of compensating for their rider's asymmetry, it just completely makes sense that could lead to injury. Now, not to freak anybody out, but this is just, as you're saying, like, if we're thinking about performance, so much of nailing your program is eliminating these variables and like these small discrepancies. That's not to downplay the importance of being a symmetrical rider in the saddle. Like you said, I think it's great that you said everyone needs to pay attention to this. Let's talk about some of these common asymmetries that you see in your work, and how to fix them. One of the things that you said is that I thought was interesting is, over the course of your 20 plus years assessing riders in the saddle, you were able to relate almost every positional fault in the saddle back to one of three main issues with the rider's seat, which is mind blowing. Like, just to name that, that almost seems like, I don't know. It almost seems like we should all have like a symmetry assessment or something like that. If it really is like these three problems that seem to be the root of all positional faults in the saddle. So let's start with collapsing front to back. What does this look like? What do we need to know about it? What's actually happening in the rider's body to cause this?
So I relate all of these kind of positional issues that I see back to these three planes of movement of the rider's seat. So how the rider's seat, so your pelvis and your hips basically, move in 3 directions of movement. So the front to back movement, the side to side movement, and the rotational movement. And so if the first one that we talk about is the front to back movement of the rider's seat, so that's how your pelvis and hips move in that front to back motion, so forward and backwards basically. And so positional issues that you'll find with riders that have issues with this is the riders that tip forward, the riders that have what we call a fork seat, so they're really tipped in their pelvis forward, riders with a chair seat where they're really tipped back in their pelvis, so they're kind of slumped a bit more in the saddle. Riders who balance off their hands, so the ones that you might see when they, or they might feel themselves that when they trot and they post or rise to the trot, that the hands come too, that they're balancing off their hands or using their hands to balance. Riders that jam their heels down or fix through their ankles, riders that grip up through the legs. I'm trying to think what other issues I see on that one. They're the main kind of ones, and it's that control of that front to back movement of their pelvis. And the muscles that I look at for that are their diaphragm, their main muscle of breathing, their psoas, their main hip flexor muscle, and their glute max, your big bum muscle basically. And those for me are what control the rider's movement front to back. So your diaphragm might seem a bit random, but that really...
wasn't expecting that one. And as soon as you said that, I like sat up kind of unconsciously. I start there with any rider, to be honest. I look at their breathing and how they breathe and if they're using their diaphragm optimally to breathe. So obviously they're all breathing because they're all alive when they come in. But your diaphragm shares fibers with your psoas, your main hip flexor muscle. So it does have an impact. So riders that maybe can't access their diaphragm optimally will often have issues with their psoas and they can't use their hip flexors optimally. And so I find that they link in together quite well. But I do look at breathing with all riders because for me, it's the key to a lot of issues. And so then if we talk about the psoas, the main hip flexor muscle, so a lot of the time the hip flexors get a bad rep. They get stretched. People complain that they're too tight, or they get told that they've got tight hip flexors and they need to stretch them, yada, yada, yada. But usually they're quite weak actually. And your hip flexor, your main hip flexor, your psoas muscle attaches to the front of your spine. I might just grab my little spine to show you. Friend. Yeah.
Grab my little friend Bob. So this is the front of your spine, the front of your pelvis, and that's your hips. And so your main hip flexor comes off the front of all of these lumbar vertebrae and the lowest thoracic vertebrae, and it comes down across the front of the pelvis and then attaches in down here at the front of the hip. So it's the only muscle in your body that attaches your spine, your pelvis, and your hip.
Wow. Okay.
And that's it.
So it's like a little bit important.
Yeah.
Otherwise you just kind of fall apart.
And people think it's kind of little and weedy. It's actually a big chunky muscle in here at the front. And so as well as, sorry, I'm going to put that down, as well as bending the hip, and that's its kind of main job if your leg is free to move. But if your leg is fixed in a position, then if you think about where it attaches, it controls the movement of your pelvis. So its job when your leg is hanging in the saddle is to control the front to back movement of your pelvis. Does that make sense? So for things like when you go to do a transition and you collapse through the transition, it's often because the rider's psoas is weak. So they don't have good control of that muscle, that main hip flexor muscle. And so it can't control where their pelvis is as they're trying to do something in the saddle.
I have a question. Everyone who's listening to this says, but when I collapse in the transition, doesn't that mean that my core isn't strong enough?
But what is your core?
Let's
Isn't
talk
that
about that.
the $60 billion question? The reason I
Don't we
started
just
this
squeeze
whole
our abs
program.
really, really hard and grit our teeth in the transition, and that makes it work? Come on.
So, one of my main reasons for starting this program, for putting stuff on social media, is because the whole core thing drives me nuts. So, I see it everywhere. I hear it everywhere. Oh, I need to work on my core. Oh, you need to work on your core. Pull in your core. Do this with your core. Blah, 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 blah. And then when you look online, everything to do with core is abs exercises. So how to get a six-pack, use your core, blah, blah, blah.
How to look like Britney Spears circa 2009. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, work on your core, obviously.
Totally.
But yeah, so I rarely use the term core. I don't like it as a term because I think it's open to such misinterpretation. It's not an anatomical term. It really came into being probably as I was finishing my physio degree and starting to work as a new grad physio. This new thing of core stability came in and it went bananas, like huge. I latched onto it as well. Hold my hands up. Nearly every physio out there went, wow, this is amazing. So there was one study done in Australia with 20 physiotherapy students where they looked at this deep abdominal muscle called transversus abdominis. And I think some of them had back pain, and that what he found is that the ones with back pain, the transversus abdominis didn't fire as quickly as it did in the ones without back pain. But there were 20 late teens, early 20s.
That seems like a really small sample size.
Tiny, tiny. But I think because as physios and as health professionals, back pain is, so common, and it has so many causes, and we don't know generally what causes it in the vast majority of people. So we all latched onto this as a cause. So it was like, wow, this could be it. This must be it. They must be weak in their transversus abdominis, must not be firing it properly. They haven't got good core stability. And literally people just took that and ran with it. And it just blew up overnight. And I spent thousands of pounds on courses to learn how to tell people to switch their transversus abdominis on, honestly. When you think back, you just think, and spent years trying to get people to use their transversus abdominis. But the interesting thing is, when you look into all of the literature that's come from the same guy, some of it, since then, there's basically no link between transversus abdominis and back pain. So in some people, yes, it will fire at different times. In some people without back pain, it will fire after they've already moved. There's no link between a weak transversus abdominis and back pain. There's no, basically all of the literature that's come since then has proven that actually it's not something you really need to worry about. But we haven't all caught up maybe with that yet. And so this core thing just goes nuts, doesn't it? And then the work of the abdominal comes in. And what I see with riders is when they come to me and they're like, I've been working on my core and I can't transition. I'm like, well, you can't breathe, that's for sure. You've blocked your diaphragm from working. So you're doing all your breathing from up here, from your shoulders and your neck, you're hanging off your reins, and that poor horse, you can't move with the horse if you're constantly tensing and bracing through your abdomen. So, what I do is I get them to breathe using their diaphragm and relax their stomach. And it blows some people's brains, even still, when you get them to do it, the difference that it makes in their whole general life, because they've maybe spent 10, 20 years walking around holding their belly button in, and they've never really taken a proper deep breath for that length of time. So you get a bit of oxygen to their brain, which always helps. But also they allow then their pelvis and their hips to move with the horse, and that's what we want. If you want to sit in a horse and look like you're not moving, you've got to move.
You've got to move a lot. Yeah.
to absorb their movement. Otherwise, you're just banging up and down, aren't you? And then, that force has got to go somewhere. If you can't dissipate the force, you're gonna be really hammering on their back. So yeah, the whole core thing. Still, it's nobody can agree what the core is. So I don't use it as a term. I don't think it's a very helpful term. And so I tend to not worry too much about people's abs. There are exercises in my program that work your abs.
Mm-hmm.
But your abdominals when you sit on a horse are not a prime moving muscle. So your abdominals bring your upper body closer to your lower body. That's what they do if you think what you do in a sit-up. That's their job.
It's like kind of the opposite of what you want to be doing in the saddle, really.
Yeah. So they have to work differently. They basically, what you're trying to do, they're almost an anti-movement muscle in the saddle. They're trying to resist external forces in the saddle. So they're trying to keep you upright in the saddle, stop you twisting so much in the saddle, and really control those external forces. So they're not prime moving muscles when you're in the saddle. So I think you don't need a six pack to ride a horse, 100%.
This is really honestly mind-blowing to me to hear you explain it, even though I have become familiar with kind of your work a little bit. So I already had a little bit of a primer into this, but I think the fact that so many people listening I'm informed on this point. I have trainers who tell them that they need to go home and strengthen their core. They need to do sit-ups. They need to do planks, blah, 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 all that sort of thing. This is going to be a big brain shift, I think, for a lot of people, and maybe actually some good news. I think I don't know, as someone who has now gone through the getting back into the saddle thing after an extended period of time off now twice, once after a C-section. I really, really focused on like tightening my belly, because that's what everyone said. Well, you had your abs cut, so you need to like really crank on those abs. And we had an equestrian masterclass that talked about sitting still in the saddle, and like the key really to being still is to move a lot. There's a lot of movement. Those riders that look like they're not doing anything, it's because they're so good at following their horse that they look quite still, because they're just in total synchronicity with the horse. Okay, so diaphragm, we have to make sure that we're breathing.
So your diaphragm works with your pelvic floor muscles and your deep abdominals. So that they control your intra-abdominal pressure. And so if you're bracing through your abdominals and holding your deep abdominals really tight all the time, then your diaphragm and your pelvic floor aren't able to work in that lovely synchronized manner. And it should be a subconscious thing. It's not something that you should have to consciously do. So what happens when you optimally, ideally, what should happen is when you breathe in, your diaphragm is like a parachute-shaped muscle underneath your lungs, so it sits kind of here. And as you breathe in,
for people who are not watching the YouTube version of this, underneath, like if you're you wear a bra under your bra,
under your rib cage,
sure.
And that's where it sits, and it's like a parachute. And so what happens is, as you breathe in, your diaphragm contracts and flattens, and that creates a vacuum, and so the air goes into your lungs. But your pelvic floor muscles, which work together with your diaphragm, relax and move down slightly. So your diaphragm moves down maybe about 15 millimeters, and your pelvic floor maybe 2-3 millimeters. And your deep abdominals, your really deep abdominals, relax, and so that allows the air to go into your lungs, your abdominal contents to move down slightly and out slightly, because your abdominal muscles are a little bit relaxed and allow that movement. And then when you exhale, your pelvic floor muscles contract, your deep abdominal muscles contract. That flattens your tummy a little bit, and that allows the air to expel. Your diaphragm relaxes and the air comes out of your lungs. And so what happens is, if you're constantly tightening your deep abdominals or pulling your belly button to your spine or contracting your core or whatever, then you're blocking that synchronized action. So you can't access your diaphragm to its full functional capacity if you're constantly holding your abdominals in. And so you're kind of affecting that lovely synchronized action that your body has to control your intra-abdominal pressure. And so what I get people to do is to work on their diaphragm, to start with belly breathing. Then we move on to kind of 360-degree breathing. So basically breathing, allowing the belly to move, but also the whole rib cage to move. And then, and that really helps them to start to relax through their abdominals, helps a lot with a lot of pelvic floor kind of hypertonicity issues that are pretty common. And it's, you know, your diaphragm's so useful. Your diaphragm's controlled by your vagus nerve. So it controls your heart rate as well. So if you can access your diaphragmatic breathing, you can really control your heart rate, which is really important when you're on a horse, particularly if they get a fright, if you get a fright, if you have fear within riding, or if you're competing. I mean, we all, well, maybe the pros don't, but, you know, us amateurs do tend to get a bit nervous before a competition. If you can access your breathing, then you can help control that heart rate, and that obviously has an effect on your horse as well.
That's where my brain was totally going as you were talking, is the link between how we think that we should ride and how we think we should hold ourselves when we ride, and how that can block our ability to regulate our nerves and our what is it, the sympathetic nervous system?
Yes, your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight response, and then your parasympathetic nervous system is that rest and digest stage, so that nice, more relaxed phase. And that's ideally where we want to be most of the time. We need the sympathetic, we need the fight or flight, obviously, to keep us safe, but you don't want to be in fight or flight all the time.
Dr. Jenny Susser, who's been on this podcast, she actually, this weekend, she had a TED Talk come out where she talks about where kind of as a peak and a valley, and how you want to be, what she calls it, like the yummy line. Like you want to be somewhere in between those with some variation of going up and down, but you don't want to stay up here and you don't want to stay down here. And I just, as you're talking about the diaphragm, I was like, I wonder how many people think that they have these major nerve issues, but actually are just going around like this, like riding like that. And if they just started to like really think about relaxing and thinking about that, how the diaphragm functions. And I think that that's really important too, is when you understand how the diaphragm functions and how it interacts with your pelvic floor. I'm wondering if you can maybe, I don't know, maybe this is a little bit weird, but just go with me here. I'm wondering if you can guide us through maybe just like a quick round of like a few breaths where we can observe and kind of try to feel what our diaphragm is doing and what our pelvic floor is doing. I have done this before, and so I'm very interested to share this with other people. Do you think that's something you could do for us?
I can do that, and I can do one better actually. I can show you a before and after. So what we can do is what I would do with my riders, and I'll try and explain it for people just listening, and then obviously we can show it as well. But I do what I call I call it a diaphragm reset, but it's just a little manual technique that you can use to try and improve your diaphragmatic breathing. So we can do both if that works.
Absolutely.
So if you're sitting, then sit up so that you're not bolt upright, but you're nice and relaxed. You're in a good position, and have one hand on the one thumb on your belly button, and the rest of your hand underneath. And so what you want
you're
to
holding
do
your
is
fupa.
try and
That's what we call it in the States. You're holding your lower belly area. For me, it's the paunchiest part of my belly. And don't do this when you're driving.
Before, but I'll go with that. No, don't do it when you're driving. So thumb on your belly button, hand on your what? Fupa. Is that what you call it?
F-U-P-A. I'm not going to say what that stands for, but just okay. It's the part that after you have babies, it gets a little pouchy. It's a little kangaroo pouch.
Okay. So yeah, hand nice and relaxed there. Shoulders nice and relaxed. And what you want to do is take a deep breath in. So as you breathe in, Remember, your diaphragm is moving down, pelvic floor moves down, stomach relaxes and moves out. Okay, and then as you breathe out, stomach flattens, pelvic floor contract up a little bit, diaphragm moves up. Okay, so just do a few of those and see if you can feel what happens through your hand. So is your hand able to move as you breathe in? Your hand moves out. As you breathe out, your stomach flattens slightly and your hand moves in. And then what we'll do is do a little diaphragm reset. So I want you to imagine you've got an upside down Y, the letter Y, going along the edges of your ribs and then up your sternum. Okay, so it's like that upside down letter. And then take the pads of your index finger and your ring fingers and just go onto the edges of your ribs and give yourself a little rub, basically from the whole edge of the ribs, work your way in. So you're rubbing right along the edge of the ribs, right up into that kind of really, often really tight bit just below the sternum.
It feels a bit tender. Is it supposed to?
Yeah, a lot of people will be really tight there because they spend their time kind of trying to pull their tummy in, or if you're stressed, that's where you tend to get really tight as well. So right in under there, then up onto the sternum. And same thing, just use the pads of the fingers to rub. Some bits will be kind of grittier or feel slightly grittier than others. And just keep working your way up the whole way to the top of the sternum. When you reach the top, just go slightly out to either side so you're almost underneath the edge of your collarbone, which is often quite nippy. So you've done that.
Feels very
Normally
grindy
I'd
for
spend
me.
a couple of minutes doing that, but we'll just do it very quickly here. And then we'll do the same thing. So yeah, it's quite nice, isn't it? So thumb on your belly button, hand underneath, shoulders nice and relaxed, and then the same thing. So big deep breath in through your nose ideally, and then breathe out.
Now, do you breathe out through your nose or
Just see
your
how
mouth?
that feels. Either or.
Okay.
Ideally probably through your nose, but sometimes, again, to access the diaphragm, I'll get people to really blow out through their mouth, like they're blowing out through a straw, because sometimes that just allows that stomach to start to move. And then out. And just see if that feels any different.
It does feel different. I also
In
feel
what way?
significantly calmer now.
Yeah, nice.
I definitely felt my belly move more the second round
Yeah.
after we did a little bit of that mobilization.
Yeah, so if a rider comes to me, then I do that to them, but I'll often teach people how to do that themselves. And then pretty much everybody I see gets homework of 20 diaphragmatic breaths at night. And I usually get them to do it lying in bed where they're nice and relaxed, gravity's assisting you. And then the same thing where the hand goes, and same thing, thumb on the belly button, rest of the hand underneath, and just allowing that breath in. And if they fall asleep when they're doing it, even better.
Okay, so we've talked about the diaphragm, but what does that have to do with actual symmetry in the saddle? I know that we're going there next, but I'm like, now I feel very relaxed, but I'm still sitting sideways.
So we'll go there next. So we'll look at so we're kind of talking about those three planes of movement. And so this we went off on a tangent, but this front to back collapse of the pelvis. So we'll look at the rider's diaphragm, we'll look at their hip flexor, and then every muscle has an equal and opposing muscle. So for that front to back movement, it's their main bum muscle, so their main hip extensor. And so I would work on accessing the diaphragm, getting them to breathe better, and then strengthening their hip flexors so that they have more control of their pelvis in the saddle, and they can move their pelvis in the saddle in a controlled way, front to back. And that really often helps so many of those positional issues that we mentioned that I find with riders in that plane of movement. So the ones that tip forward or back, that collapse through transitions, that fix down with the heels, they all do that to try and gain some control in that front to back plane. But if you can strengthen those muscles and get better control in that front to back plane, you don't need those issues to, they will reduce. And so the same with the hands. When they bounce off the hands, if you strengthen them through psoas and glute max, then the tendency to go to the hand is less.
And I want to do a little bit of perhaps myth busting here too, because I've heard some people say you can only work on that in the saddle. Like only riding is going to help you improve in that area. And I know that you don't agree with that view, and maybe I can share a little bit about my experience with your workout program too, but tell me why that's not true.
Well, absolutely not, because most of us as leisure riders have one horse, maybe two horses. You're going to have to do an awful lot of training, and if you have those issues, your horse is going to be compensating for you, like the way that we talked about, and so you need to do it off the horse. If you want to improve how you move on the horse, you really need to train off the horse, 100%, because otherwise you are loading them differently. They are compensating for you. You're getting further into that vicious circle. How do you bring yourself out of that? So for me, you do the work off the horse to improve how you move on the horse. I think that's the best way to do it. The only way to do it.
Right. And you have a system that involves a bungee. And I was lucky enough to get to try this myself and use it over the past week. It was a little bit sneaky, because I have to say, when I was actually doing the exercises, I didn't feel that they were particularly strenuous. I felt like it would be a really good warm up before I rode or something like that. It didn't feel to me like, oh, I just did a workout and like, man, I need to sit down. But interestingly, the next day I had like a measurable amount of soreness, which really surprised me, because it did not seem proportionate to the amount of effort that I had to put into it. And so then you tell me, but that seems to me that maybe there is actually some weakness there that I'm not acknowledging.
So the exercises in the bungee are designed to work your muscles through the range, but against that consistent resistance through the range. And so muscles contract in different ways. So muscles contract isometrically. Let's go back. So muscles move joints. That's their job. And so a muscle can contract isometrically, so it holds a joint in one position and doesn't allow it to move. It contracts concentrically, so it shortens itself, and that's how it contracts. And then it contracts eccentrically, so it contracts as it lengthens, which is harder for a muscle to do. And when we're on a horse and when we're trying to move with the horse to look like we're not moving and to dissipate the force that's coming from the horse, because that's our job, we need to dissipate that force, then we do that by eccentric muscle contraction. So think about if you were walking downstairs or jumping off something, and the way that you land, so the softer you land, the more your muscles have to dissipate that force. They're dissipating that force with eccentric muscle contractions. And so I designed these exercises that are done against this resistance of the bungee, so that your muscles are working both concentrically, but especially eccentrically. So they're having to work into that lengthened position. And sometimes eccentric muscle loading can cause a little bit of muscle soreness, usually the next day.
Definitely have that.
Some people usually think that, some people do feel that they don't feel a lot when they're doing the exercises. Some do, actually. It just really depends on the person. But I think because of the way that they work the muscles eccentrically, some people do feel it the next day. But workouts you don't have to feel a workout for it to be a good workout. That's another myth. You don't have to feel, you don't have to feel a muscle burn for that muscle to be working. You just need to stick to something. And I think I see that a lot at the minute, because obviously Instagram and Facebook and TikTok, whatever, have loads of exercises now that people can do, and people will jump maybe from one to the other, and they don't really stick at something, so they'll and then you get no carryover. So if you want to improve, you've got to find something that works for you and stick to it. It really is the consistency of doing an exercise program that's going to give you that long-term benefit. And I think maybe that's where we've gone a bit too far with the social media exercises and things, where people will just pick things and they'll do it a couple of times or they'll jump from one thing to the other. And if you want to see benefit, you've got to kind of do the basics over and over and over and over again. And that's where the improvements come from. That is where the gold is. That's where the money is.
I also think that, when I was doing the exercises myself, I thought this is such a useful tool because I'm not essentially asking my horse to fix my body for me. I'm not using him up in order to correct these. Like, I'm correcting these on my own time. And honestly, part of that is like, that's part of the horsemanship conversation, in my opinion. It's the same way that we think about like, if you're an amateur rider, you probably need a good amount of practice jumping and seeing a distance and getting a rhythm and all of that sort of thing. But where does it become that the horse's responsibility to be like your one method of practice versus like using other tools that we have, watching videos, listening to podcasts, doing a mental visualization, watching other people's rounds? Of course, those are not going to replace actually jumping your own horse, but there's a lot that we can do in other situations that do not put miles on our horse, that don't ask them to compensate for us if you do have some sort of asymmetry there. And so that really stood out to me as, this workout was simple enough and short enough that you could do it on a rest day when you're not riding. You could do it before you ride. Honestly, you could do it after you ride. It was simple enough and straightforward that consistency factor would, for me, in my opinion, would be pretty easy. It wasn't like a 2-hour workout. I think the whole thing took, I don't know, 25 to 30 minutes, somewhere in
it usually takes range. About 20 minutes for the level one, and then about 25 maybe for the level two. I designed it exactly like that for those exact reasons. Equestrians are busy people. You've horses to look after, you've horses to ride. I have 2 kids, I have 2 dogs, I have 2 businesses, I have a horse. I don't have a gym membership. I don't have time. I need something I can do at home. I do other stuff. I do cardio stuff. But I need something that fits into my life. And if you can make something fit into people's lives, they're much more likely to do it. As a physio, I know that. If I give people a list of 10 exercises, are they going to do them? If I give them 3, much more likely.
Yeah.
That's people. That's
sure.
Human nature. So to work within that, I think making it short, making it really targeted, and that's why I designed it like that. And it really strengthens the hip flexors and all of the muscles, gluteus medius, which we'll talk about in the next bit. But it really targets those, and they're the important, in my opinion, the most important muscles for riders in the saddle.
So we've talked about riders who collapse front to back. Should we move on to collapsing a hip? So this is, if you think about how you sit in the saddle, these are riders that your pelvis is either tilting one side or another. And I'm going to guess that this also sometimes means that your shoulders, you see riders have one shoulder that they want to lift up higher than the other. Is that a result then of the pelvis?
Yeah, so these are the other kind of the next, of the 3 kind of main issues with the rider's seat. This is the next plane of movement. So this is the coronal plane or the lateral plane, so the side to side movement of the rider's pelvis and hips, and so commonly known as collapsing a hip. But yes, riders that collapse to one side, riders that drop a hip, riders that drop a shoulder, or that fix through one seat bone more than the other, that riders that use uneven stirrups or that feel that their stirrups are uneven even when they're not, maybe riders that always are losing one stirrup, always the same stirrup, riders that grip up more with one leg or that fix with one hand. And so I would relate all of these positional issues back to this side-to-side movement of the rider's pelvis and hips, this collapsing through a hip. And this comes down to your what we call your lateral sling muscles, so your gluteus medius on one side, which is a muscle on the side of your pelvis, and then quadratus lumborum on the opposite side, which is a muscle that attaches your rib cage to your pelvis at the back. And so gluteus medius is really important in a rider. I talk about it a lot on my socials. But gluteus medius as a muscle, so it's right on the side of your pelvis, so it attaches round. I'll grab this again.
If you're watching the YouTube version of this, she's breaking out her spine and pelvis back for us.
So it attaches here around the edge of the ilium, so the side of your pelvis, and then it comes over the side like a kind of fan shape, and then attaches down in here. And so its job is to lift your leg out to the side, so to abduct your hip, to help extend your hip, so to help bring your leg back, and it also helps rotate your hip. So it does those 3 different movements with your leg. But equally, or possibly more important, its job is to control the level of your pelvis. And so when you walk, when you take a step, I might stand up for this bit just to show you. So when you walk and one side of your femur is fixed, so say you're going to take a step forward, so the leg that you're swinging forward is freely moving, so your femur is moving. The leg that's on the ground, planted, your femur is fixed. So what happens when you take a step forward, or what could happen, is that your pelvis drops on the swinging leg as you swing through. But what your gluteus medius on the standing leg does is it contracts, and because your femur's fixed and you can't move your leg, it pulls that side of your pelvis down. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Which brings this swinging leg side of your pelvis up, because your pelvis is a fixed unit. And so it does that as you swing through to keep your pelvis level. So if it didn't do that, what would happen is you would collapse down on the swinging leg, and the standing side would come up. And so if we think about what we do on the horse then, and how that might work on the horse, is if we were sitting and say my right leg I wanted to give an aid with, so I wanted to move my right leg slightly back, move my right hip, so my gluteus medius would work to bring my leg slightly back on the right side, but my left gluteus medius would work really hard to keep my pelvis level as I do that, because if it didn't, then the left side of my pelvis would tip up and the right side of my pelvis would collapse down. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a lot of information.
No, but if you're able to, again, if you're able to see this version on YouTube, it's very easy to kind of like replicate what Maeve is saying in your own body. It makes me think of like the Shakira hips a little bit.
Yeah, a bit like that. But what you'll see a lot commonly in riders is that so say they are trying to give a right leg aid, so their left side of their glute med isn't working properly, so it's not controlling that level of the pelvis. So the left side of the pelvis comes up, the right hip collapses down, and then their left arm comes in and collapses down. The left shoulder drops down. They fix with the left hand because nobody wants to fall off. Otherwise, you're going out that side door to the right, aren't you? So you're going to fix down through here. And so some riders will always look like this. They will always have that left shoulder lower because their left side of the pelvis is up. And actually, people then are like, oh, you're so weak through your right hip. Actually, it's your left glute med that's not controlling the level of your pelvis. Does that make sense?
How would somebody who's listening be able to, is there a way to like kind of test this in the saddle? Like would the most helpful thing be actually to watch a video of yourself ride? Like how would you tell if you've got this issue going on, if you're maybe not bodily aware enough to feel it? Because not everybody has honed that skill yet, right? Of being able to feel like those slight asymmetries in their body. I think the more you practice it, probably the better you get at it. But you certainly can see it. I'm thinking especially like in the flying change, I see this, and even over fences, I see people do this with their bodies. But what's a good way to be able to tell?
Usually your instructors probably yelled at you for the same thing over and over and over and over again. And if you're an instructor listening to this and you're fed up yelling at people over and over and over again for the same thing, they can't help it. So the rider that does that and that collapses through the right hip because their left glute med isn't controlling the level of the pelvis, and then fixes down with their left shoulder and fixes with their left hand, they can't change that themselves. without strength. They need to strengthen their left glute med, and they need to get better control. And you yelling at them, yeah, it might take their attention to it, but they're never going to stop doing it, because if they stop doing that, they're falling off to the right. And your body's not going to let you do that. So no matter how often the instructor yells at them to stop dropping the shoulder and to relax that hand, they're going to go back to it, because we don't want to fall off. Your brain's going to really stop you falling off as much as it can. And so on the horse, you could tell, well, actually, if you do, I'll maybe run through it now, a little test that I do with riders where you look at how you move through your pelvis. So if you're sitting, again, in quite a nice upright position, then I would get the rider to roll their pelvis forward and back. And so allowing that pelvis to move. So you're kind of tilting your pelvis forward, if you like, and then tilting it back, and see how that feels. So that's doing it in the middle. And then what I would do is get them to roll so that they take more weight onto their left seat bone and really load the left seat bone, and then do the same thing. Can they roll their pelvis forward and back while loading the left seat bone? Is that easy? And then get them to do the opposite, where they shift the weight onto the right seat bone and then roll the pelvis backwards and forwards. And can they do it on that side? And what does it feel like left to right? And quite commonly, if people have issues in this plane of movement, then it might be that they find it really hard on one side, that it's really fixed and they haven't got a lot of movement. And then when they roll off to the other side, they almost fall over because it collapses and they don't have as much control on that side. And so that's a nice, simple kind of test to do.
Cool. My left side is definitely harder. I like that test. That's neat. It's instant feedback.
It's a nice test. And then on the horse, what they can do is, if they load unevenly, and especially if they're aware of it, and they fix with, say, so let's go back to the left hand, because we've worked through that, the whole kind of example. Then what I would do, if it's safe to do so, and their horse is quite nice and calm, is to take their reins into their right hand and then to lift their left arm up over their heads. And what that does is it automatically drops this left side of the pelvis a little bit, and then evens up their weight pressure through their seat bones. And so I might get riders that sometimes, start to fix through the left seat bone, collapse through the right. I might get them to take the reins into the right hand, do that for 10, 12 walk steps, and then go back to normal. But as they, every time they maybe take a wee walk break, they do that again, so that they feel that even loading through the seat bones.
Cool. Sweet. Okay. So, one question that I did have is, as we're thinking about this, just to underline this, I feel like, to summarize a little bit of what you've talked about, is when we have an asymmetry in the saddle where we're either dropping the side of our pelvis one way or the other, it's not so say you are somebody who rides around with your left hip jacked up. Is it more about strengthening the part that's weak or relaxing a part that's tight, or is it some combination of both?
Usually some combination of both, but with that example, that collapsing of the hip, it's usually with strengthening.
Okay, but so that's strengthening that gluteus.
The opposite side that people think it's going to be. So maybe, if you feel you've got a really weak right leg aid and you can't put your right leg on, maybe is it to do with your right leg being weak, or more commonly, is it to do with your left gluteus medius not controlling your pelvis properly, so that when you go to give a right leg aid, you collapse to the right and you've no give with that aid because your left gluteus medius isn't controlling the level of your pelvis properly. Does that make sense? That's where it gets a little bit complicated, but really important as riders, that we look at gluteus medius and we strengthen it and we work on the control of it through all of its functions, so that its function in moving the hip out to the side, moving the hip back and rotating the hip, but massively important, its function of controlling the level of the pelvis.
Shall we move on to riders who twist?
Can I just go back to glute med for 1 second?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So the other kind of reason that I started this online exercise program and the social media was because I see the exercises that I saw or that my riders were coming to me with, that they were given, I didn't love them. And so for gluteus medius, still, I see the clam exercise being given out time and time again. They call it the clamshell.
Clamshell.
So where you lie on your side, knees bent slightly, and then the leg on the top, you open and close it like a clamshell. And that's another myth, that is a good exercise for your glute med, because it's not. And so, again, it still seems to be the exercise of choice for a lot of people, that when they're, if they're told that they have gluteus medius issues, this is an exercise that they're given. There were 2 huge meta-analysis studies done. So a meta-analysis is when they gather up all of the scientific studies that they've done and look at them all. And 2 huge ones were done, and actually clamshell exercises were one of the least effective exercises for gluteus medius activity when they looked at ECG studies, and they reckoned that they got about 20% activity with a clamshell exercise compared to loads of other standing, single leg standing type exercises. So it's really not hugely effective. And what I find as a physio is that clamshell exercises are really irritating for a lot of people with hip conditions or with underlying really minor hip conditions. So any kind of lateral, so pain at the side of your hip, which is really common in women, particularly as we get older and hit perimenopause and menopause. Then what we call gluteal tendinopathy or lateral hip pain is really common. They reckon about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women have issues with that. A clamshell exercise will really irritate the gluteal tendon a lot, and actually make that condition worse. And also people with any kind of anterior hip pain, so pain at the front of their hip, because of that twisting torsional action, then it makes the tendon of the psoas muscle flick over the bone, and again can really irritate a lot of underlying hip conditions. So it's another big bugbear of mine that I see all the time, and a big reason for starting this is that it's not the most useful exercise. If you like it, great, do it, and you find it helpful, brilliant. But if it's sore, don't do it, please. There are loads of way more effective exercises to do.
Can you tell us one of the exercises that's in your program that specifically that you think really, really hits the glute med?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of them. So anything on the one leg. So in the level 1 where we stand on one leg, like the high knee march type thing, and lift the opposite leg. On the standing leg, glute med is working really well. The side lunges, when we're lunging into the pressure of the bungee, glute med is working really well. In the level 2, the fat thigh exercise, the one that goes around the inside of your thigh, shows all your big bits. That one is really good because again, you're standing on that leg and it's controlling. Glute med is having to work really hard to control the level of your pelvis.
Okay. That's one of the areas that I felt like was sore on me the next day, even though I didn't feel any specific burning while I was doing it, which is interesting. And the clamshell thing is actually very interesting. I find that exercise very irritating. I always feel like a popping kind of sensation. So that's great to know that we do not have to do the clamshell exercise.
You don't. And if you like it, great. I'm a physio. I'm never going to stop you doing exercises. If you like exercises, brilliant. I don't want to put anybody off doing exercise. All my job is to encourage people to do exercise. But it's finding the right one. And if you want more bang for your buck, clamshells is not the exercise for glute med control. And it really irritates me that I see it time and time again on socials being given as the best exercise to get your glute med working, or brilliant exercise for horse riders. It's not. There are loads more. Anything single leg standing is way better, way higher ECG activation rates than glute med.
I have one more question before we move on to riders who twist. Do we need to be stretching our hip flexors a lot?
No.
Okay, there we go. It's like, is that really something we need to focus on a lot?
No. So again, that was another reason for starting it. That's another exercise that I see given time and time again. Most of the time when I test them in clinic, their hip flexors are weak, not tight. And so tightness is a sensation. It's not a physiological change in the muscle. It's usually a sensation. It's your brain saying, that feels tight, please stop. So, and usually it will happen because the muscle is weak. So your brain is trying to save it, if you like, trying to, again, your brain is always on danger alert. So if your muscle is a little bit weak, your brain will say, oh no, that's too tight. Let's stop there.
Okay.
And so I have a huge feedback from people who use my program that they had really tight hips, really tight hip flexors, and then it's been massively beneficial because they're strengthening their hip flexors through range. So that concentric to eccentric contraction, which is really important for us as riders, because that's how we dissipate the force of the horse. And so is that main hip flexor muscle. You need to have good eccentric control of it to be able to dissipate. You don't need to stretch it.
Great. I hate doing it, so that's great. I will never do it again. Awesome. Let's talk about riders who twist, which sounds like a fun dance, but it's not.
So the third kind of movement plane that I see issues with riders in is that riders that in that transverse plane, that twisting, rotating rider in the saddle. And a lot of people relate to these positional faults, which I'll run through in a minute. But actually what I find in clinic is that if a rider that rotates or twists in the saddle usually has one of the other issues as well, sometimes all three. So I don't usually get riders that twist in the saddle that don't also collapse through their pelvis or collapse through a hip. So it tends to be a knock-on effect. So they might be riders that feel like they have one seat bone further forward than the other, or do look like they have one seat bone further forward than the other in the saddle, one shoulder further forward than the other, one leg further forward than the other, that they have difficulty turning their body in the saddle in one direction or in both directions. Sometimes they might have a head tilt or fix through the jaw a little bit. Might fix through one hand, and they might have real issues connecting through that inside leg to outside hand. And they find that really difficult. And often that's because they have issues within the muscle groups that control what we call the oblique slings. So at the front of your body, that would be your oblique abdominals on one side, and on the opposite side, your hip adductor muscles, so the muscles that run down the inside of your thigh. And at the back, that would be your piriformis and glute max on one side, and then the opposite latissimus dorsi, which is like a big triangular back muscle, on the opposite side. And so that crosses across the sacroiliac joint on the pelvis to control, so basically how one side of your body talks to the other. And that's probably where we come into the abdominals a little bit more, and where the abdominals really come into their own on the horses, that control of rotation, and that controlling the external forces that make you want to rotate on the horse. And that's probably then where I would get the riders working on their abdominals, so more as an anti-rotation muscle than a prime moving muscle.
Okay. So I don't know if this is jumping the gun at all, but as you were describing this, I have felt the sensation in myself, and I've talked to other riders who have described the same thing. What do you make of it when we feel this ourselves doing this on some horses, but not on other horses?
Then you're probably compensating for the horse in some way. And so so the same with the collapsing of the hip, actually, and didn't really touch on that, or a saddle that slips is often due to the horse more than the rider, and how that horse is moving asymmetrically. So if you feel that more on one horse more than the other, then it is probably due to how the horse is moving, and then your body's ability to control that movement and dissipate that movement.
Got it. Okay. when we are feeling that, I guess with each of these, is there anything that we can do actually in the saddle? So whether we feel that we're collapsing front to back, whether we feel that we're collapsing hip side to side, or we're twisting, aside from doing the exercises out of the saddle, is there anything in the moment that we can focus on in our bodies to try to combat any of these feelings? Because I know I've felt these in my own riding before. And it's like, it sucks. Like, it sucks to go through the entire ride feeling like you're constantly like trying to pick something up or, you know, stop twisting, or like one of your legs isn't working or whatever. And I've found this varies a lot depending on the horse that I'm on. I don't feel it on all horses, but I feel it on some horses. Is there anything you can do in the moment to help?
Yeah, I think saddle fit is a really big topic, probably a huge topic for a whole other podcast. But the saddle has to fit the horse, but the saddle has got to fit the rider as well. And so your pelvis needs to be able to move in the saddle for you to be able to move with the horse. And so if the saddle is not allowing your pelvis to move, and not allowing your hips to move, then the force has nowhere to go. So for example, huge knee blocks that block you at the front of the knee will stop your thigh from moving. Therefore, where does the movement of the horse get dissipated to, you know? So I think that's a huge topic. And a lot of the newer, fancier, more expensive dressage saddles with the huge blocks.
Oh my God, some of these blocks are getting out of hand, y'all. Yeah. Like, I don't know.
Cantles, and there's nowhere for the rider's arse. I mean, where do you put your bum in the saddle if there's no seat left? And so, so I think that's a big topic. But you have to be able to move your pelvis on the horse. If you can't, you cannot control their movement. You cannot, dissipate that force that comes from them. So that's a huge thing. Other than that, on the horse, I think things like that little rolling your pelvis back and forward and then shifting your weight, I'll get riders to do that on the horse, because that's really good for your body awareness, so that at how you can move your pelvis forward and back. There's all this talk of neutral pelvis, another term that bugs me a little bit, because your pelvis needs to move. So you need to have your pelvis in a starting position where it can move. Neutral pelvis is different for every single person. Nobody is the same. And actually, there again a huge study done on pelvic tilt, and they found that basically most of the universe has an anterior pelvic tilt. So they did a big study on people with no back pain and looked at what they at their pelvic tilt. And it was 80% of men and 70% of women had what they called an anterior pelvic tilt, but with no back pain. So that's your normal anatomy.
Can you tell people what anterior pelvic tilt is if they don't know?
Yeah, so if people probably hear neutral pelvis banded about a lot. And so what neutral pelvis actually means, so if we look at my nice pelvis model again, you might have to look at this on YouTube if you're listening. So the front of your pelvis here, this bony prominence, is called your anterior superior iliac spine. And then at the back of your pelvis, you have another bony prominence called your posterior superior iliac spine. And so what they class as neutral pelvis is that if you took a line and drew it between there, that line would be on the horizontal. And that is what they call neutral pelvis. Now, not everybody's pelvis is exactly the same. So for some people, their anterior superior iliac spine might be slightly higher or lower, and they will naturally have what we call an anterior tilted pelvis, where the front bony prominence is lower than the back bony prominence.
So for people who are listening, think about like the classic equitation position where you're taught to kind of stick your butt out behind you a little bit. Like that's kind of how I go in my mind, where like, where your the distance between like your pubic bone and your belly button gets bigger, not smaller. And so then that leads us to posterior pelvic tilt, is where that distance
The
between your
opposite.
pubic
So you're
bone
rolling your pelvis back, basically.
Sure.
So, yeah, so for everybody that's going to be different because it depends on your pelvic anatomy, and we're all different, and that's normal. So you've got to find a good kind of mid-range start position, because you need to be able to move your pelvis front to back, side to side, and it needs to be able to rotate. So when you walk, your pelvis is able to move through those 3 planes of movement. When you sit on a horse, it needs to be able to move through those 3 planes of movement, and that's really important. And so, yeah, so using that little exercise that we talked about earlier, where you're rolling your pelvis forward and back, you can do that in the saddle. Then shift your weight onto one seat bone, roll the pelvis forward and back there, shift the weight over onto the opposite seat bone, roll the pelvis forward and back there. That's a nice exercise to do, to just bring your body awareness to your pelvis and how your pelvis is in the saddle. Another little thing that I'll talk about on my page or give my riders to do is to imagine that you have little feet stuck to your seat bones. So little tiny feet at the bottom of each seat bone. And so as your horse takes a step with his right hind, and his right hind steps underneath him, your little tiny foot on the right side of your pelvis needs to take a step forward as well. And then as your horse steps his left hind forward, the little tiny foot on the bottom of your left seat bone has to take a step forward, and so it goes on. So basically, as he walks, your pelvis walks. And then you take that up into the trot. So for people who really struggle with sitting trot, that's a really nice way, because people often, the sit and trot, brace through their core.
Yes.
And then bounce like mad. So you need to be able to breathe. Yeah, really sucks for the horse. You need to be able to breathe, first of all. That's really important, like we talked about with your diaphragm, so that you dissipate that force and that you've got good intra-abdominal pressure. But also you need to allow your pelvis to move. And so thinking of your little tiny seat bones and thinking of the horse, how the horse is trotting, and let your little tiny seat bone feet follow his hoof pattern. That's a really nice way to get into your sit and trot.
I love that. It's very cute too, little feet.
And then the turning in the saddle. This was a tip actually that my instructor gave me, which I really like, which is imagining that you've got a camera in your belly button. And so say if you want to turn to the right, it's your camera, your sat-nav camera that turns, so that you turn from your thoracic spine, so the middle of your spine where all your ribs attach, so you turn from there rather than turning your whole pelvis and then collapsing.